That morning, Miral had called them for training, that Osrith was establishing, for they would be close to Watling Street at a town called Leighton. Aldhelm had given a speech about how the mercenaries, themselves, would run the heathen bastards from the boundary of their kingdom. But before Osrith could leave, the men were to train. She felt she was under scrutiny from those watching, 2 lords of Mercia. Ethliad not there, but Lords Burgard and Ludica watched as she drilled and drilled how she wanted them, before leading them out of Aylesbury with food and supplies. They were one of 8 bands replacing 8 others at strategic points along the old Roman road. This was one of a number of times Osrith and Elfgar were dispatched to the border of Daneland were many, and they were unforkingly long periods of time in the damp and cold to nearly everywhere along their Watling Street dividing line. At Lee, therefore, Osrith began with the specialized training in between watch periods. It appeared to her that the men had not been trained for the shield wall, and she remembered her own training at Wessex, with Steepu and Miral. Click of shield, bend knee, brace for onslaught. If you were in the middle, you were likely to be worm food come dusk, for this was where most enemy focused their power. A month later, and Osrith's band could assemble automatically. But there was much more to teach them. Tactics, skirmishes, the value of thinking ahead, and thinking what the Danes might be thinking. Several raiders had come to no good under her watch, and she had cause to reward them with silver of her own for bravery, and for quick thinking. Elfgar had told her that none of them wished a new commander, when they returned to Aylesbury and had been given the choice of one, so Osrith continued to lead them when they were sent out again, this time against the Welsh borders raiders who hoped to steal cattle and sheep. 88,888,888. And so it was, her exhausted men slept a dry night under their cloaks on the ground not far away from where Osrith's ancestor, Oswald, had been slaughtered by the last pagan mercenary king. Oswestry, she had told them, earlier that evening, as they sat eating a fortunate catch of rabbits made by Falkberg and Leofstan, who had trapped 4, which they had shared between them. What do you know of the place? My mother told me about King Penda, Egelwulf said, as Elfkin snuggled into his brother's arm. Mighty King Penda, victorious over the Christians, who took apart King Oswald piece by piece. Indeed. Elfgar grinned. And when men touched his body, which never spoiled, they were cured of all manner of illnesses. That was here, Osrith said, not far from here. And his kin moved his body to East Anglia, for his final resting place. She put her hand on Bue's hilt. Lamgwin, he was called. White Blade. And now we mercenaries revere Oswald, as do the Northumbrians, of course. Elfgar looked to Osrith, who nodded. He is a saint to us all. Yet, his body lies in danger, of course, from the Danes. And the bastards gained help from the Welsh, commented Oshir, the people of Wales, the Cymric, never failing to be a common topic of griping if ever unity was sought between the mercenaries. But, Osrith was ignorant of the subtlety of the comment. Because the bastards could, Elfgar pointed out, ride into Mercia to help either Penda or Oswald. Now they couldn't, for Offa, king of Mercia 100 years after, had ordered a great big ditch to be dug from Chester to Gloucester. And then it was dark, the men asleep, and Osrith and Elfgar were on watch duty. She had instigated 2 people on watch, as the Gaels and Irish did. When there were hit-and-run attacks, having enough backup could be the difference between winning or losing. They had quelled a minor skirmish to the east of Chester that day. Norfolk had produced Danes or Norse who had tried to plunder the village of Worm. Osrith had taught her men what it was she had been taught, that is, to observe what is going on, observe the landscape, the weather, anything that might cause a change in events, and needed to be taken into account. Then to direct all their resources into fighting a mass of opposition. My lord, Osrith knew about the enmity between the kingdoms, and asked Elfgar to speak of his homeland, and she listened patiently as he detailed where he had owned lands, with Miral, and that his family had lands in the very centre of Mercia, near where names lingered of when the Saxons were pagans themselves, Woden'sfield, Wodensburg, even Pentford. Close to where the men slept, travellers walked past them, their caravans gaily decorated with coloured cloth. A thought struck Osrith that they might have something she could buy from them, for it had been nearly 2 months since she had had the last of her lily root to prevent her bleeding. Elfga, Osrith noticed, was carefully inspecting the caravans too, and it took her a little bit of time to realize what had caught his attention. More accurately, who? 2 women smiled back to Elfga. Which would you? Elfga began, then broke off, realizing his mistake. Well, she might have. She had heard of women loving women, and her thoughts fleeted to have. But, no. You? Osrith asked. The one on the left, Elfga admitted, as the tall, dark-haired gypsy who looked not much older than Osrith, glanced back towards him as she led her dark brown horse. Of course, not you, Elfga continued, but then, Elfrith told me of your ... you were married. His words trailed to nothing, as if the dark night air had suffocated them. Elfrith should not have, Osrith snapped back, but then softened, and began to pace with Elfga around the other side of the diminishing campfire. I was married, hand-wed, she replied, softly. What is that? Beside them, on the floor, all wrapped up in their woolen cloaks, one of their men snortled in their sleep. It is marriage for a year, Osrith continued, glad it was dark so that Elfga could not see her face. So see if you are. She struggled for the word, to see whether it works. And you were hand-wed? We said the words, Osrith confessed, and a breeze sprang up, making Osrith sense that the Scythe were alive in this part of Mercia. But Iron, it is not like Wessex or Mercia, it has spirits in the land, the Scythe, and the most powerful Scythe is the Morrigan. Perhaps she considered we were mocking the words, because Tagged was explaining to me what hand-wed was, and in the end, I felt closest to him than I have ever done anyone in my life. We agreed our marriage would be forever. Osrith smiled, weakly. And Tagged now? Elfga prompted. He burned to death. Osrith knew she was speaking, bluntly, of Tagged the Diamond's death as if she were discussing the weather, or the price of flour. She was not over it yet, but it was far away, and not now or here, in the northwest corner of Mercia. You? It took a little while for Elfga to answer, but then he leaned towards Osrith. I had a lady, but she's gone from this place now. Osrith turned sharply to him and they stopped their walk of the perimeter of the camp. Gone? Died? Elfga shook his head. Married to a ... lord. He stuttered a little. He stopped walking, and looked at Osrith, plaintively. Look, her name is Elswith. Like King Alfred's wife? Osrith asked, suddenly recognizing the name. No, not like his wife, Elfga said slowly, and realization suddenly began to flood her mind. Not like Alfred's wife. It was Alfred's wife. Osrith thought of the proper, buttoned-up woman, Etgelfled and Edward's mother, who could only be in her 30s. How old was Elfga? The same. She is of Sceolf's line, of the recent kings of Mercia, and I fell in love with her, he continued, as if it were a burden being unshouldered. But I could not wed her, for suddenly, Alfred was king and in need of a wife, Wessex was in need of an alliance with Mercia. Did she love you? Osrith asked, thinking of Alfred's wife, who had probably been the reason she had had to leave Wessex. A blessing, considering, face saved, no more Ethelwold, and her ambition to speak to her brother solved. If she was never going to tell him anyway she was his sister, there was no need to be in Wessex. I believe so, Elfga nodded, somberly. But she was proper, and would not let me so much touch her hand, and that made me love her all the more. Osrith laid a hand comfortingly on his forearm and Elfga smiled, sadly. And then I tried to follow her, and that displeased Lord Sceolf, and I was passed to service of Odda. The old fool has died now, and we have Lord Ethelred. Drop dead at Ethelred and Ethelfled's betrothal ceremony, Osrith knew. At least Miral was with me with Lord Odda, in his shame. Ethelred is fair, at least. And he is better? A better lord, I mean? He is different than Odda, then lowered his voice as if the animals of the night might be listening. He has not the ambition of Alfred, though he has ambition enough. Then Elfga brightened. I have been allowed to come home, with Miral. They continued in the autumn and into the winter months to guard skirmish points and, as her men's skills developed, Osrith's confidence grew. She taught the men to think before they attacked, to observe everything they possibly could before planning a move, just as Sainid had taught her. Then they should turn themselves to the best possible advantage. What was the land like? Where could they get the most from a flat land, such as near East Anglia, and why it was different in Salop? By knowing the plan, Elfka continued one evening, as they sat around a peat fire, backing Osrith. You know we act together, and then you can attack with the strength of will of your comrade. And they were very successful, sending wealth back to Aylesbury and Lord Ethelred, and securing the villages and towns which had the misfortune of being on their Wetling Street border. They returned to Aylesbury, very briefly for the Christmas period, and Osrith noticed Ethelflaed's manner had not improved when she sat beside her husband for the feast. And then, they were back to the border, now near a place called Tamworth, where Danes concentrated their forces on the town, and where Offa, the great king of the Mersons, had once had his palace. You seem to know a lot about how Danes think, Elfka said, 4 weeks after being in Tamworth. It was one evening when they were on patrol through Tamworth's streets, as the winter's bite was beginning to give way to spring. She looked up to the stars, which were clear, and she remembered the previous Christmas, Yule, Eric had called it. Because I was in the company of one, once, Osrith admitted, before I came to Winchester. You astonish me, Elfka admitted, although he did not look astonished. Osrith had astonished him before, and he had heard some of what she had done, and known some too, from being with Lord Odda, although Osrith was still careful what she said. He was easy to talk to, though, and Osrith was pleased to have a friend. A Norseman, Osrith specified, as they reached the northern walls of the town. It. Osrith struggled to formulate the words as Elfka's steps fell away and he stopped, listening. Let's put it this way, she began again, standing next to him, and staring into the black night. We were probably going to die at the hands of a common enemy. We kept one another alive as he found his men and I found my way back to my lord. But then, I was lost to my lord, so came south, Elfka added. He listened, Osrith thought. And you learned? How they think, what they do. I learned Norse. I am good at Norse. They are very like the Cymric, those who are still attached to their gods. It is themselves and their gods alone, they have no priests. And they think rationally about things, logically, win or lose, and feel the same about it. And it is this Northman who taught you to fight? Elfka asked. No, it was my lord's general who taught me to fight, after my disastrous time on the battlefield. When you killed Ivarlo Ithbroek? Osrith looked at her deputy, the moonlight shining off his face. She knew Elfka knew this wasn't the case, and wondered whether he was trying to undo her story, to check if it was true after all. It would be something she would do. When my lord Skin killed Ivarlo Ithbroek, Osrith clarified, continuing to pace west, towards the strip of orange that was all that was left of the sunset. Across from them, at the southern wall, Leofstan and Falkberg would be pacing anti-clockwise to them, checking for disturbances. I had little idea about what I was doing, so I made it up as I went along that day, wearing the prince's armor, because his father wanted him kept safe. It was the first time Osrith had told anyone about taking Constantine's place. Now, with time and distance from the event, it seemed mundane, comical, even. But Elfka looked amazed. But, you could only have been. I was a tall 12-year-old, Osrith admitted, and I had the anger of the loss of my family at their hands behind me. I am good at fighting. More women should try it. I couldn't see else with fighting, Elfka admitted, and Osrith got the impression that she might be the only person he could talk to about their Lady of Wessex. You never know what women can do unless they have to, or are allowed. It is normal for all women in Irian to fight, at least to protect themselves and their families. Women have led men in battle, before Christianity. Their priests, their druids were equally likely to be women as men. I have always wondered why the church has imposed this outlook, Elfka admitted. Offa's wife commanded women. Why should there not be a queen in Mercia who fights as equal to a king? Women are to be commanded by their husbands, and have obedience, Osrith reiterated. Which is why I have no husband, and never will. And, another thought struck Osrith, as they headed back to the center of Tamworth, meeting Oshir and Egwulf on their way out for their patrol on the walls. Yes, she would like that, Queen Ethelfled of Mercia. But, it could only be done if Ethelred would be called king, and Alfred would never allow King Ethelred to be king of Mercia. 88,888,888. Spring was indeed springing. Buds were beginning to grow, and birds were more animate, singing earlier in the morning. The ground was beginning to feel alive with growth as they slept upon it, its quickness into Osrith's very soul. She liked Mercia immensely, but had still not managed to shake off her brother as easily as she had hoped. Despite being 100 miles from him, rumors came to Osrith's ears every so often of Uthod's success in battle, that he had the nickname, Daneslayer, and another one, the Wicked. The Uthod Osrith had known would have relished those names. But there was another, one which did shock her, that he had been named future king of Mercia by a dead man and, too, Uthod had been given command of the Wessex faction of men, who were to attack on the south side. At least Lord Ethelred was consistent, and stood up for his kingdom as many demands were made of its gold and its resources. Then, when Easter had passed, the men had trooped out, with baggage trains and armor to head to Mercia's ancient city, revered by the Romans and had, until recently, been home to just a few hundred Saxons. Now, it was home to a few thousand Norse and Danes, who had instigated many atrocities to the people who lived there, killing hundreds, raping and enslaving more. And the Mercians and the West Saxons were about to drive them out. So the Mercian army was marching out to reclaim Lundine. It was Mercia's land, and Wessex had a vested interest to keep their trade route of the Thames open to the north of their kingdom. Aldhelm had given a rousing speech to the men, and then they headed southeast to war. "Why are you shaking your head?" Elfgar asked Osrith as they walked behind the baggage train, the ground dry and the day fine as a late spring sun shone down, as if blessing their objective. "The Lord Ethelred, and his wife," Osrith said, finally, as Ethelred's carriage passed over a bridge. "You mean, bringing her?" Elfgar was stunned, as Osrith gestured ahead of them. On a black horse, tall-backed and stately, sat Ethelfled. She sat nobly, but Osrith thought that she knew what she would see if the Lady of the Mercians was to turn round, and it didn't sit well with her. "It is madness. Why bring your wife to a war?" Osrith asked. "Unless she asked to go," Efrith suggested, a thought which had not occurred to Osrith. Perhaps that is something she might do. Osrith had seen Ethelfled fight and be taught by Steeper. Maybe she had insisted on being brought, although why Ethelred might acquiesce to such a request from his wife. And yet, there was something changed about her. No longer the favorite child of the king, perhaps married life did not suit her, where mature, considered decisions and opinions were needed. Perhaps she was with child? If so, then surely her husband was insane to bring her with him, risking both his line of succession as well as Ethelfled. Yet, Osrith also felt sorry for the woman. While she did not like her, the appearance of bruises on her face angered her, and the thought crossed her mind that she would like to give Ethelfled the opportunity to learn to defend herself. No woman should have to suffer a beating, no matter what the Southern Church said that the Bible instructed them. It was not written in the Irish Church to treat women so, which Osrith had long decided that it was this church which was hers in her heart, brought to Northumbria by Oswald, her ancestor, doubt introduced shortly afterwards by his brother-in-law, Edwin, who had Paulinus, of Augustine's teachings, minister to him. In fact, the Irish Church had not flourished long in Bernicia, and many of the priests, such as Coleman, had returned to Arian when King Oswy took the Augustinian path. Yet there were many who still followed the Irish Church, and that, Osrith realized, delineated the border between Pitland and Bernicia far more distinctly than whoever was on the throne. If Domnall wanted to gain land to the Roman wall, and thus incorporate Bernicia into Alba, he would do well to send his own monks and priests, adherents of the Irish Church, to reinvigorate the old belief. This was probably why Cumbraland had been so difficult to incorporate into Northumbria, Old religious rites died hard there, and even older ones, those of the Britons, harder still. But they did not go directly to London as first planned. A council of war had been convened somewhere outside the city, and the armies stopped and set up camp at a place called Paddington. "He is calling for his captains," Elfka said, when her band had set up camp for the night, and reported to Miral for distribution on patrol. Osrith, who had been about to accompany her men and find out her own patrol, stopped. "Who?" "The Lord Ethliad," Elfka clarified, and pointed to a large canvas tent where already Wessex soldiers were carrying chairs and boards which were to be table. And towards the tent was striding ... someone they knew. "Come on," Osrith grinned, as Steeper stopped to point out to one of the carts. 2 soldiers hastened to it to bring whatever King Alfred's head guard had wanted. "It will be good to see people we know." But Elfka's face fell. "He has asked for his captains. We are to go on patrol." And it was at that moment Osrith realized how much she depended on Elfka for support with her men, to listen to her ideas, to ask his advice. "Then I'll tell you later," she said, "when they've finished discussing and a decision has been reached." Although, with those two, Elfka pointed out Utad and Ethliad, "I may see you tomorrow," they could never agree on anything. And so it was. How strange it was to stand in close proximity to her brother and not have the will to tell him who she was. That a strange longing, that need to tell him, had fallen from Osrith. Mercia had given her something she could never imagine, and she was good at it. Miral had told her so before they had marched out, and that the message had come from the Lord Oldham. So it was with confidence that she stood with the other 8 captains behind her lord as they sat around the negotiating table and discussed their move. Utad sat opposite his cousin, and beside him was Steeper and the Lord Odder, who caught her eye and nodded with a smile. Could Osrith have asked for more than to have been noticed by her former lord? And beside Steeper was ... someone Osrith took a time to recognize, as talking began. Alfred had given London to Ethliad's care. This was debated by her lord, through Aldhelm, who argued, how could Lord Ethliad be given something he already owned? No, Steeper clarified. It was Ethliad's to defend, his responsibility, which took up a large part of the proceedings. There was a debate as to where to attack the city, Utad wanting to split the Wessex and Mercian army and put them at different places. In contrast, Ethliad wanted a concentration of force, so that any resistance inside would be able to be eliminated. "So, what are you going to do, Ealdeliad?" Utad said, eventually. "Fight, of course." Ethliad sneered. "Now we just have to agree how we are going to do it." Observe, orientate, decide, act, Osrith thought, just as Sainid had taught her, just as Steeper taught his men, and Miral had tried to instill in Odder's guards. Was it the same in armies all over? And then, as the negotiations began to consolidate into an actual plan, and she listened with eager ears for the part she was going to play, Osrith's head turned back quickly to the man beside Steeper. Alfred had not come, but he had sent his son. A sword was drawn as Osrith entered his tent, later that evening, and she met it with her own. "Is that any way to greet an old friend?" Osrith asked, when he realized who it was, and he dropped his sword and grabbed Osrith unexpectedly around the middle. "Osrith!" he exclaimed, when he finally let her go. "I knew you had gone to Mercia. I thought I might see you, but ... oh. You are never here to fight, Edward?" Osrith asked. "You are never involved. Your father would never allow you to come here for this?" "I can fight, I am as good as a man," he replied, defiantly. And the Etheling had definitely grown in the 6 or so months since Osrith had seen him. "Are you as good as a woman also?" And it hit her then how much she missed guarding him. He was so happy, all the time, a happy child, and happy to see her now. But this time his face fell, and he looked serious, and he leaned close to Osrith's ear. "I miss you, Osrith. You are no longer my guard." Osrith pulled away from his hands, which were resting on her own, and smiled. "Then we can be friends now," Osrith replied, feeling, despite herself, happy to see him too. "Oh, I am pleased," Edward exclaimed, with old boyish enthusiasm. but then dipped his head away from her and crossed the grass carpet of the tent and stood by the opening. "Her name is Egwin," he said eventually, the worry being admitted to Osrith now, "and she is the daughter of a priest," he continued, his eyes sparkling at Osrith when she went to stand by him. "She is delightful, and she talks to me, Osrith, she listens." And Osrith listened to the wonders of this young woman of Kent, who Edward was so taken with. Before hugging him like a younger brother, she thought of him as, and telling him to take care, for he was indeed returning to Winchester with a faction of guards. Alfred would not be that stupid as to let his son, who is not yet a man, face Norse and Danes in a siege, Elfgar said, later on, when Osrith relayed the raiding plan to him. "Let's hope the plan does not disintegrate," he added. On the subject of the two-attack plan, Utud's plan, for Ethelred has his own ideas and may decide to use his initiative which, while sound, may be disastrous, and... But Elfgar broke off and clicked his tongue in warning as he spotted Miral approaching them and Elfgar made to go. "This concerns the both of you," Miral said, his voice returning to the hard, resentful one Osrith recognized, and they followed him to Aldhelm, who stepped out of Ethelred's tent to speak to them. "My lord had requested that you are to guard his wife," Aldhelm said, plainly. "Elfgar is to take on your captaincy, temporarily," he added, when he saw Osrith's place. "He will carry out your intentions for your men, in the plan you heard this evening. Please brief Elfgar with all he needs to know, and Elfrith is to be promoted temporarily, to his deputy." "But my lord." Osrith's shock came to her lips, then tunes to petition Miral. "How will it look to my men, the other captains, to my deputy?" Here she gestured to Elfgar, "after the effort you have put to make me on equal footing. There is absolutely no reflection on you or your work. You are a most capable captain, Osrith," he revealed. "But Ethelred sees that you are a warrior who has the unique properties that he is looking for in the Lady Ethelflaed's bodyguard. My lord commands that you guard her." But the shock was still with Osrith. Had she not done all the work to get these men, 3 very young and 2 rather older and inexperienced, to be excellent soldiers? "And when the battle is done, you may return to your men," Aldhelm added. He looked briskly at Elfgar and added, "Please bring Osrith's belongings to her." "Everything I own I have with me," Osrith said, hoping that her tone was not too grudging, and she nodded to Elfgar. "Make sure Ossier does his share, for he has a tendency to loaf if left. And see that Elfwin has a new jerkin. He has grown since he was last clothed." With a salute, Elfgar and Miral marched away, and Osrith looked across to Aldhelm, who was looking down his long nose to her. "He does not trust other men to be around her," he confided softly, so as not to be overheard. And it suddenly became clear to Osrith what properties meant, as she followed Aldhelm to Ethelred's tent. Ethelflaed was alone, for it seemed that, temporarily, the job of guarding her had been left to Aldhelm. "I do not need guarding," Ethelflaed complained, when Aldhelm had left. Osrith found a place inside the tent to stand, so she could see outside, so she could be aware of danger near the edges of the tent, so she could see Ethelflaed, to ensure she did nothing which compromised her own safety. After a time of pacing around her tent, Ethelflaed giving her side looks as she paced, her face on the near side yellow with old injuries, she folded her arms and glared at Osrith. "Do not let him beat you, lady," Osrith said, bluntly. Ethelflaed opened her eyes in amazement that she had spoken and strode over to her. "How dare you deign to speak to me?" "I dare because I have been given the responsibility to guard you, to protect you," Osrith replied. "And if you can protect yourself, that will be one less thing I have to do." And, before her eyes, the defiant, angry lady of the Mersons turned her face from Osrith. Her shoulders began to sag, and then move up and down. She was crying. "My lady," Osrith managed, after a few swift steps towards her, placing a comforting hand on her back which, to Osrith's surprise, Ethelflaed did not shrug away. "I can teach you, should you wish." "Why?" Ethelflaed asked, through quiet, whimpering sobs. "Why would you? Why should women not protect themselves? Mercia is not Wessex, lady. You can make your own mark here, as the lady of the Mersons." Osrith bent closer to her ear. I have seen you fight against steeper. Some of the men I fight beside in this army would die of shock if they were half as good as you were then. And, I expect you are better." Ethelflaed's sobs ebbed to nothing, and she drew away from Osrith, crossing to her belongings and picking up a comb, with which she neatened her hair. Nothing she had could take away the signs of her abuse, however. Then, the lady of the mercenaries turned to Osrith. She expected Ethelflaed to order her away, but she did not. What she did do was something Osrith did not expect. "Show me. Train me," she implored, in an urgent, low hiss. "I have need of it." So she did, thought Osrith. You are very good, cool-headed. You make a plan, you stick to it. My father remarked upon it. What could she say? Osrith thought later. She could not refuse a plea from a lady for protection, especially if King Alfred rated her abilities. After all, "My lady, begin by building your strength," Osrith advised. "You cannot begin to work on blade skill without eating well. Can you do that?" But, nothing could come of the plan just then, for Ethelred entered the tent. He nodded at Osrith with a cursory glance, then batted his hand away from her. "I am to leave, my lord." "Yes. Go," he snapped. As Osrith trod towards the cool night air, she turned, as a movement caught the corner of her eye. Ethelred has hit his wife, though she had made no noise when she was struck. At that moment, all anger that she had felt towards the woman dissolved and, had he not been her sworn lord, Osrith might have attacked Ethelred, for Ethelflaed not pushed him back. She must show her, Osrith thought, as she stood beside the tent, disgust flooding her stomach, and she waited in the darkness, an empty feeling in her chest, as the realization she was not going to her men, to be their captain, left her. A group of men laughed and joshed their way along the line of tents, their mirth filling the air, her brother amongst them. Osrith watched them heading away from the camp, presumably for some night's entertainment, and wondered when she would be back in charge of them. But all thoughts of her captaincy came to a bone-shuddering, heart-racing halt as desire crept over Osrith's body and made her breathe deep. She had seen the man on Utad's right-hand side. Christ was on God's right hand in heaven. He was dear to her brother as he walked beside him. Finan. Osrith dearly wanted to talk to him, by all that was holy she did, but it risked weakness to her position. Fantasy, and 10 minutes with her own fingers would have to suffice. Perhaps it was her staring that had caught their attention, however, and to Osrith's dismay her brother was marching over to her as she stood away from the royal tent. "I thought you were supposed to be guarding the lady," Utad said, accusingly. "She is with her husband. Lord Ethelred ordered me to leave. I do not think that they would wish me to stay there for that." Osrith hoped her face showed the defiance that she felt, but the interval was longer than she anticipated before Utad stepped back. She turned to look to her brother's right-hand man. "Thank you for saving my life in Winchester." "The water wasn't deep enough to drown in," Finan replied. "I was just helping you along." Just helping you along. That was one of his phrases. He would say that a lot and Osrith would notice his shrugging off of difficult things, or when he was shown gratitude as, "just helping you along." Morantain, she added, for good measure. Utad had begun to walk off, but Finan didn't, and stood in front of Osrith. "So, you are in the mercenary army now?" Behind her brother, Osrith thought she saw Sihrik and Osferth bend their heads towards them to catch any words they could, as Utad stalked past them. "I was recommended to Mercia," Osrith replied, trying to not let her bitterness enter her tone, although there was not much to be bitter about, when she had a position which was eminently advantageous to her. Finan bent a little lower, and put a hand by his mouth. "Elswith would have something to do with it, no doubt," he confided. "Alfred liked his women when he was younger." "But, I am," she broke off as Finan grinned. "You are," he agreed, and Osrith laughed at the thought, for they had never heard that of Alfred before. "I never would have guessed, not the king of the West Saxons," she replied. "So, why are you here? Is it the air, or something?" "It's not as good as Alba," Osrith admitted. "No," she continued, sinking down onto one of the baggage carts. The Mercian army are not as picky as the West Saxon army is. Finan sat beside her, though with a socially appropriate distance between them, and smiled at her. "Oh, I don't know, they let you to fight for them, so they do." Despite herself, Osrith smiled. "Mercia is losing many men on the frontier of Daneland. And I am good at what I do." "A woman leader?" Finan pressed. "You should know more than anyone, are you not of Irian? A woman can be Druid, a woman can be Olam. A woman can be a soldier. But you are of Alba." It was a statement, and told Osrith that there was a second man with whom she had spoken who remembered things. "I was raised in Alba, certainly. I came into the service of a king. I can fight." "I know," Finan agreed. "I've seen you." And it was then that Osrith remembered that he resembled someone she knew, only then, she could not place it. She would not be able to place it for a long time. An owl hooted, and the feeling that she must be more formal with the Lord's man settled upon her. "Oikmuth," Osrith said, bluntly, and got to her feet. When Finan got up too, she raised a hand. He looked at her palm, and Osrith knew he had seen her scar. Quickly, she drew it back, and nodded towards Lord Ethelred's tent. "Shiare," Finan called to her, before going back to camp.